Are you looking for a new skirt pattern to make and wear this summer? Sew along with me when I make my third version of the Luella skirt from Tilly and the Buttons. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel and welcome to my first sew along. So if you haven't heard of it already, this is the Luella skirt. So this is one of Tilly and the Buttons' latest sewing patterns, and it's a lovely tiered and gathered skirt with an elasticated waistband. I think it's perfect for a beginner sewer as it's really quite straightforward to sew, quick and easy, and perfect for the summer weather that we're having in the UK at the moment. I'll link the pattern in the description box below if you fancy picking one up for yourself. I've made two versions of this skirt already, one for me and one for my mum, and I'm really looking forward to making my third version with you. So first things first, fabric. So as this is a lovely floaty summery skirt, the pattern suggests light to medium weight woven fabrics that gather easily and gives recommendations of cotton lawn, poplin, double gauze, seersucker, linen blends, etc. My first version I made out of this lovely linen blend with a floral design, which worked really nicely. It's got a lovely drape. And then this version I'm going to use this more crisp fabric, which is a cotton seersucker. So size wise, I normally fall into a size 3 for Tilly and the Buttons patterns, and this one was no exception. So with my waist measurement being 28, that falls into size 3 nicely, and then my hip measurement is about 36, so that falls between the 2 and the 3, but I always go with the 3 just to be on the safe side. So we only need waist and hip measurements for this skirt, so that's really quite straightforward, and so I'm going to cut out a size 3. So design wise, the first decision to make is how many tiers that I want. So my first version I made a 3-tier skirt for myself, and for my mum I made a 2-tier version. This time I'm going to go for the 3 tiers again because I quite like the maxi length. Then the next decision is whether to go for the frilled exposed seam or just a normal seam. This time I think I'm going to go for the frill because I've never actually sewn an exposed frill seam like that before, so I'm quite interested in learning how to do it and practicing that technique. And then the final thing to think about is whether you want pockets. I'm not a massive fan of pockets. That might be controversial. I know a lot of sewers do like pockets a lot, but I always think that they add a bit of volume to the hip area, so I'm going to leave the pockets out of my version. So one of the first things that I do to prepare for a dressmaking project is pre-wash the fabric. I just throw it in the washing machine at the same temperature that I use to wash clothes. And the main reason for that is to get rid of any shrinkage that might occur in the fabric before the piece of clothing is sewn together, but also to remove any residues or coatings that might be remaining on the fabric from the manufacturing process. So I've sped this clip up a little bit. I don't normally iron quite this fast, but just to say that this is obviously me ironing the fabric after I've put it through the washing machine. This seersucker came out quite wrinkled, as you can see, so I'm just trying my hardest to get as many wrinkles and creases out of it as possible. I also try to iron fabric flat rather than folded in half, because then you try to avoid having that crease down the middle that might then be harder to get out later on in the dressmaking process. So pattern tracing. I've already traced out my pattern because I've made this skirt before, so I'm not going to trace it out again, but I thought that I would talk a little bit about why you might trace your patterns in the first place and some equipment that you might want to use. So first of all, why would you trace your pattern? We'd really trace it out so that you can retain the original one to use it again in the future, in case you want to make it in a different size or you want to make it in a different style, for example. So then you've got the original there untouched to use again. In terms of equipment, ideally you could use some dressmaking tracing paper, or maybe something like this, which is a dot and cross paper. But if you don't have any of that, then you can just use any paper that you can really see through enough to trace.
that you've got lying around. Sometimes I've just used A4 sheets stuck together if I don't have anything else. I'd also suggest that you use a sharp mechanical pencil so that your lines are really fine and precise. Weigh your patterns down, so weigh both layers down with some kind of weights or a can of beans or something like that, so that they don't shift around while you're tracing, and just try and be as accurate as you possibly can. So in terms of alterations, the main alteration I made to this skirt when I made it the first time was to remove some of the length, because I'm about 5'3", 5'4", so I wanted to remove about 3 inches from the total length. So to balance that out, I decided to remove 1.5 inches from the first tier and 1.5 inches from the second tier. So as I said, I've already made the adjustments to my main pattern, so I thought I'd just do a little much smaller version to show you how I did that. So this is just a little replica of the first tier that I've drafted. This is the shorten and lengthen line, so it's just 2 parallel lines that you'll see on most patterns, and that's where the pattern designer recommends that you shorten or lengthen in that position if you need to. So what you do to remove 1.5 inches is just cut along one of the lines, it doesn't matter which one, straight as you can, and retain the second piece. Then you need to draw a line up from the bottom cut line that you've just made. Let's just pretend that this is 1.5 inches for the example's sake. And then you'd take this small piece that you've cut off and move up to that second line that you've just drawn, like that, and then tape it down. And then if you have a little jog at the side like this, then all you need to do is take your ruler, line your ruler up with this length side here, and then draw down like that, and then just snip that little piece off like that, and then it's all nice and straight, and you've removed the amount of length that you want to from your pattern piece. I did make a few other adjustments to my pattern the first time round, and I'm going to explain those in the blog post that I'm going to do to go along with this video. So I then moved on to cutting my fabric out. So the pattern instructions do have a cutting layout diagram showing the best way to place the pattern pieces on the fabric, and I more or less followed that, but my fabric came from the shop in 2 separate pieces, so I just split the pattern between the 2. And as you can see, for the smallest 2 pieces I folded the fabric into the middle so that I had 2 folds, one on either side, to save on space. And then I cut out the rest of the skirt with the fabric folded in half. I drew around the pattern pieces with a friction pen, pinned around the pattern pieces to hold them in place whilst I cut them, and then used a nice sharp pair of fabric shears to cut them out. The first step in the sewing process is to take your 2 top tier pieces and lay them right sides together on top of each other like I'm doing here. And then I pinned down both side seams ready to take them to the sewing machine. And you can see here that even though I tried not to iron a crease into the fabric earlier on in the process, there is still one remaining from when the fabric was folded on the bolt at the shop. It is sometimes hard to get that out, but I'll use lots of steam when I'm ironing this piece throughout the next few steps. So now onto the waistband. So I sewed that together in exactly the same way as I did the first tier, placing the two waistband pieces right sides together, pinning and then sewing at the side seams. And here I'm trimming down the seam allowances to reduce any bulkiness in that area. So now the side seams of the waistband are sewn, it's basically a big loop. And I went ahead and took it to the ironing board, folded it in half lengthwise so that the wrong sides are together and that the raw edges meet. And then I pressed a crease at the folded edge, which will ultimately end up being the top of the waistband. The next step was to join the waistband that I've just pressed to the top of the first tier. I'm matching the side seams of that first tier with the side seams of the waistband, and my top tip here is to use a fork pin to get those seams to match accurately. Hopefully you can see that in the video just about. I'm then pinning round the rest of the skirt, aligning the 3 raw edges. So that's 2 raw edges from the waistband, which has been folded in half, and then the 1 raw edge of the top tier. And the instructions say to leave a gap of about 4 inches, and this is where the elastic will be put in one of the next steps. The instructions say to measure your waist and take 10% off that measurement, but I found that was a bit tight for me, so I just put the length of elastic round my waist and tried it on as I'm doing in this clip to find out what was comfortable. Now I have my waist elastic cut, I can put it into the waistband. So I attached a safety pin to both ends, attached one to the seam allowance around the gap in the stitching, and then threaded the other end through the channel of the waistband, feeding it through gradually until it comes out the other end and both ends meet. And I did forget to say earlier that I'm actually using elastic which is narrower than the pattern recommends, and that's because that's all I had available and I didn't want to go to the shops. So I did amend the waistband pattern piece to match that, and I'll write about that in my blog post that I'm going to put on my website. So I also joined 2 shorter pieces of elastic together to get the length that I needed, so you may see the join in the middle. So now that the elastic is threaded through the waistband channel and I've sewn the two ends together so it's a loop, I now need to close up that gap in the waistband. This is a bit tricky, and I found the easiest way to do it was to pull the elastic taut so that the waistband fabric is not gathered, and then very carefully pin those 3 layers together. It is quite difficult and it feels like you need another pair of hands, but it's only a small section to do, so hopefully you should get there in the end. The only thing left on the waistband is now to sew some lines of stitching through the middle to secure it in place and ensure the elastic doesn't shift around when I'm wearing it. So again, I took the arm off the sewing machine to make it easier to sew the loop, and I've changed the stitch length to 4.5mm, and I'm stretching the elastic from in front of the needle and behind so that the fabric on the waistband is flat and not gathered as I sew. So here I have already sewn the second tier together in exactly the same way as I did the first one, right sides together and sewing the side seams. And now I'm moving on to creating the exposed frill seam on the second tier. So I've pressed the top of the second tier to the wrong side by 1/4 inch twice, and here I'm sewing that down, and this will be the frill on the outside of the skirt. So now begins the task of attaching the second tier to the first tier. Firstly, I matched the side seams of both tiers and attached them with a pin, and then I found the middle of each tier and attached those with pins too. And then I started to gather up the fabric between each set of pins and try and distribute it as evenly as possible. I do find getting even gathers quite tricky sometimes, so mine could be more even, and hopefully I improve a little bit each time I do some. Once I've distributed the gathers, I pinned them in place, making sure to align the top of the second tier with the line of stitching I did on the bottom of the first tier. And you can see the red line of that stitching on the screen now. Getting towards the finishing line now. So I sewed and attached my third tier in exactly the same way as the second tier. The only difference would be if you have 3 panels instead of 2. So I didn't, because I wanted to reduce the volume of the last tier on the skirt. So I only had 2, which I will explain a bit more in my blog post if you're interested in that. So I then went on to hemming. So I tried the skirt on in front of a mirror to check what kind of length I wanted, and I decided to go with just the normal pattern suggestion of a 3/4 inch hem. So I took the skirt to the ironing board and pressed 3/8 inch twice, pinned it down, and then sewed it in place about 1/4 inch from the bottom edge. And here she is, the finished Luella skirt. So I hope you enjoyed sewing along with me making the Luella skirt. And if you're a beginner sewer, I hope you've picked up some tips and techniques along the way. If you're planning a Luella skirt of your own, then do let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear all about it. So until next time, bye for now.